Paul Sterling had spent the last 10 years doing nothing. Retirement had turned his days into a gray haze of coffee, old case files, and the hum of a refrigerator that never stopped. The city moved on without him, its rhythms becoming distant noise. He lived in a small apartment on the edge of the city, a place chosen specifically because it had no view of the courthouse. He did not want to see the building where justice was sold and bought. But the past had a way of finding him anyway. It found him on a Tuesday morning in the form of a news alert on his phone. A city councilman had been found dead in his penthouse. Single gunshot wound to the back of the head. Beside the body, a small brass paperweight engraved with a single word, "Guilty." Paul stared at the screen for a long moment. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled slightly as he set the phone down. He recognized the signature immediately. 10 years earlier, 5 prominent figures had been killed the same way. Each victim had been acquitted of serious crimes. Each crime scene held a personal object with the word "guilty." The press had called the killer the judge. Paul had been the lead detective. He never caught him. Now, after a decade of silence, the judge was back. The official investigation would dismiss the connection, a copycat, they would say. But Paul knew better. He grabbed his coat and walked out without locking the door. The precinct had changed beyond recognition. New faces, new technology, and a new captain who barely looked up when Paul walked in. The request for the councilman's case file was denied in 3 clipped sentences. Cold case detectives did not walk in and take over active investigations. That was the message. Paul did not argue. He simply turned and left, but he did not go home. Instead, he made a phone call to someone he had been avoiding for a decade. Riley Quinn was 27, a data analyst who had built her career on finding patterns others missed. She worked for a private security firm now, but her real expertise lay in the dark corners of the internet where people bragged, confessed, and planned their sins. 10 years earlier, her father had been the judge's 5th victim. A high school teacher wrongfully accused of a crime he did not commit. He had been acquitted, but the stain of accusation never washed away. The judge had executed him anyway. Riley had been 17, watching her father's name dragged through public opinion before a bullet ended it. Paul had promised her he would find the killer. He had failed. When Paul called, Riley answered after 1 ring. She already knew. She had been tracking the case since the body was found. There was a pattern already, and she needed to show him. Paul hesitated, but he went. The address she sent led to a warehouse converted into offices. When he arrived, she had 3 monitors running, timelines, maps, and data streams. Her theory was that the judge had not stopped, he had simply gone quiet, waiting for the right moment. Riley's theory was simple and terrifying in its implications. The judge had not spent the last 10 years in hiding, licking wounds or fading away. He had been watching, waiting, and refining his list with the patience of a predator who had learned to savor the hunt. On her screens was a database she had built over years, every acquittal in high-profile cases, every instance where public opinion had screamed for justice that the courts refused to deliver. She had cross-referenced that with unexplained deaths, disappearances, and suicides that had seemed natural at the time. The results were on the screen, cold and damning. 18 names. 18 people who had been accused of serious crimes, acquitted, and later died under circumstances ruled accidental or self-inflicted. Paul stared at the list for a long time, the weight of it settling into his bones. Riley believed the judge had killed them all. The method had changed. No more bullets to the head. Instead, car crashes, falls, overdoses made to look like accidents, like fate. The killer had gotten better, more patient, more invisible. Paul felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the warehouse. The question was why return to the old signature now, after so long? Riley had an answer for that too. The councilman had been about to be appointed to a federal judgeship. The judge was not just killing, he was sending a message. The old method was meant to be recognized. The killer wanted everyone to know that no one who escaped justice was safe, not even those about to sit in judgment over others. Paul spent the next 3 days inside Riley's warehouse office, the outside world fading into irrelevance. They worked in companionable silence, only the clicking of keyboards and the rustle of printed reports breaking the quiet. Riley fed the known victims into her pattern recognition software, searching for a connection that the police had missed a decade ago. The original investigation had focused narrowly on the victims' crimes, assuming the judge was a moral crusader selecting targets at random. But that assumption had always felt incomplete to Paul. There was something else linking them, something buried in paperwork and forgotten testimony. On the third night, the software found it. Each of the original 5 victims had been represented by the same defense attorney at trial. A man named Martin Cross. He was a high-powered lawyer known for getting wealthy clients off on technicalities, a man who had built a career on reasonable doubt. The victims had not known each other, but they had all hired the same man to protect them. Paul remembered Cross from the original investigation. The lawyer had been questioned briefly and dismissed as irrelevant, a minor footnote. Now, a new pattern emerged. Among the 18 deaths Riley had catalogued over the past decade, 15 had also been represented by Martin Cross at some point. The judge was not targeting the acquitted randomly. He was systematically eliminating everyone Martin Cross had helped walk free, burning a path toward the man at the center of it all. Martin Cross still practiced law, though his reputation had dimmed like a fire starved of oxygen. He had taken fewer high-profile cases in recent years, reportedly due to health issues that kept him out of the public eye. Paul and Riley found him living in a gated community on the north side of the city, a place of manicured lawns and silent streets where money bought privacy. They watched his house from a rental car for 2 days, the monotony broken only by the occasional movement behind the curtains. Cross rarely left. A nurse visited twice a day, arriving with medical bags and leaving an hour later. A private security car circled the neighborhood every hour, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Someone was paying for protection, and Paul suspected it was Cross himself. On the second night, Riley pulled up financial records that told a quiet story of fear. Cross had made a series of large, unexplained withdrawals in the past 6 months, cash, totaling nearly $200,000. He was not spending it on medical bills or luxury. He was preparing for something. Paul wondered if Cross knew he was on the judge's list. Perhaps he had always known, sleeping uneasily in his guarded house. The withdrawals suggested he was planning to disappear. But the judge had a long memory and a longer reach. If Cross was the thread linking all the victims, then he was also the ultimate target. Paul realized they were not just chasing the killer anymore. They were racing against him, and time was running out. The stakeout ended abruptly on the third morning, the quiet tension shattered by movement. A black sedan with tinted windows pulled up in front of Cross's house at dawn, its engine idling. 2 men in dark suits got out, spoke briefly with the security guard, and entered the house without knocking. Paul watched through binoculars, his heart rate steady but his mind racing. 10 minutes later, Cross emerged with a single suitcase, leaning on one of the men for support. The men guided him to the sedan with practiced efficiency. Paul's instinct screamed. This was not a planned medical appointment or a casual trip. This was an escape. He started the car and followed at a distance, keeping 2 cars between them. Riley worked quickly on a laptop, tapping into traffic cameras and tracking the sedan's route. The sedan headed east, toward the airport, never once hesitating. Paul pushed the car faster, running yellow lights, weaving through morning traffic with the focus of a man who had nothing left to lose. Riley warned that airport security would stop them if they tried to approach. Paul did not answer. He was focused entirely on keeping the sedan in sight. At the airport, the sedan pulled into a private hangar area, the gates closing behind it. Paul parked at the perimeter fence, watching through chain link as Cross was escorted toward a small jet. The engines were already running. There was no time to call for backup, no time to do anything but watch as the plane taxied to the runway and lifted into the gray sky. Riley found the flight plan filed under a shell company. Destination: a country with no extradition treaty. Cross was running not from the judge, but from justice itself. The plane was gone, a speck swallowed by clouds, and with it, any chance of using Cross as bait or protection. Paul sat in the car for a long time, staring at the empty runway through the chain link fence, the weight of failure pressing down on him again. Riley was already working, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard, unwilling to let the trail go cold. She accessed the private hangar's booking records, the shell company's payment details, the phone logs of the men who had collected Cross. One name surfaced repeatedly, rising from the data like a shadow given form. A man named Derek Hale, a former police detective who had been fired for evidence tampering 10 years earlier. Hale had been working as a private security contractor for the past decade, moving between firms that did not ask too many questions. He was also, Riley discovered, the brother of one of the original judge victims, a woman acquitted of embezzlement who had been killed in the first wave. Hale had lost his job, his reputation, and his sister to the same system that had protected her wealthy employers. Paul remembered him from the old case. Hale had been questioned as a potential suspect but was cleared due to lack of evidence, his grief mistaken for guilt and then dismissed. Now, Paul saw the full shape of what had been hidden. Derek Hale was the judge. The killing had never been about abstract justice or moral philosophy. It was deeply, bitterly personal. Hale had been methodically destroying everyone his sister had hired to defend her, everyone he blamed for her death. And now, the man at the center of it all, Martin Cross, had slipped away, leaving Hale's final act of vengeance unfinished. Paul did not wait for authorization or backup. He drove to Hale's last known address, a rural property 2 hours outside the city, the roads narrowing from highway to county gravel. Riley stayed at the warehouse, feeding him information through a secure line, her voice a low constant in his ear. The property was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, with a long gravel driveway that disappeared into overgrown trees. Paul parked half a mile away on a logging trail and approached on foot, moving through the underbrush with a caution born of decades on the force. The house was dark, its windows like empty eyes, but a shed behind it had lights on, a yellow glow spilling from a dusty window. He moved carefully, staying in the tree line, each step measured. Through the window, he saw Derek Hale sitting at a workbench, cleaning a rifle with slow, deliberate movements. On the wall behind him hung a map with dozens of photographs pinned to it, connected by red thread. Paul recognized some of the faces, the original victims, the 18 from Riley's database, and more, people whose names had never appeared in any police report. Martin Cross's face was centered at the top, with a red line drawn to an airport symbol. Hale was planning to follow Cross. Paul's foot snapped a dry twig, the sound cracking through the night air. Hale went rigid, then moved with the speed of a man who had been waiting for this moment. He turned off the light and disappeared into the darkness of the shed, leaving only silence behind. Paul dropped to the ground, pressing himself against the cold earth as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The woods around him seemed to hold their breath. He waited, listening for footsteps, for the click of a weapon, for any sound that would give away Hale's position. Minutes passed, stretched into an eternity. Then came the creak of the shed's back door, barely audible. Hale was not coming toward Paul, he was moving away, deeper into the forest. Paul pushed himself up and followed, using the faint moonlight filtering through the trees to navigate. The chase became a silent contest of patience and instinct, two men moving through the dark, each knowing the other was there. Riley's voice in his ear urged him to wait, to call for backup, but Paul ignored her. He could not let Hale disappear again. Hale led him through the woods for nearly an hour, doubling back twice, trying to lose his pursuer. But Paul had tracked men before, in worse terrain, with less light. He stayed on the trail, reading the broken branches and displaced leaves. Eventually, the woods gave way to a clearing, and there, at the edge of a small pond, Hale stopped. He stood with his back to Paul, the rifle at his side, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. Paul stepped out of the tree line, his hands raised but ready. Hale turned slowly, and for a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. The moonlight caught Hale's face, revealing a man hollowed by years of grief and purpose. Paul saw no madness in his eyes, only a terrible clarity. Hale spoke first, his voice calm and low, asking if Paul remembered his sister's case. Paul said nothing, but he remembered. He remembered the evidence that had been thrown out on a technicality, the procedural error that had let a guilty woman walk free. He remembered the public outrage that had faded within weeks, leaving only the family to carry the weight. Hale pointed the rifle at Paul's chest, but his finger was not on the trigger. He explained, without anger, that the system had failed, that the courts had protected the guilty while the innocent watched. He had tried everything: appeals, media campaigns, private investigators, and nothing had worked. So he had taken justice into his own hands, one person at a time. Paul listened, his own hands steady at his sides. He understood the logic, even if he could not accept it. The question hung in the air between them: what happens now? Hale lowered the rifle slightly, looking past Paul toward the road, where distant lights were beginning to cut through the trees. Riley had called for backup despite Paul's orders. Hale smiled, a thin, tired expression, and said that Paul had not come to stop him. Paul had come to understand. And understanding, Hale believed, was the only justice either of them would ever get. The first police cruisers appeared at the edge of the clearing, their lights washing over the scene in pulses of red and blue. Hale did not run. He stood where he was, the rifle now resting against his leg, watching the officers fan out with weapons drawn. Paul stepped between them and Hale, raising a hand to signal them to hold their fire. The moment stretched, fragile and tense. Hale's eyes met Paul's one last time, and then he knelt slowly, placing the rifle on the ground and his hands behind his head. The officers rushed forward, their shouts filling the clearing, and within seconds Hale was on the ground, handcuffed, his face pressed into the damp earth. Paul stood apart, watching as Hale was read his rights. There was no resistance, no struggle, no final act of violence. Only surrender. When they led Hale away, he glanced back once, his gaze not on Paul but on the dark line of trees where the woods met the sky. Paul understood. Hale was not surrendering to the police. He was surrendering to the end of his purpose. Martin Cross had escaped, and without that final target, the hunt had lost its meaning. The system that had failed Hale's sister would now judge him, and he would accept whatever came, because in his mind, he had already completed his work. The investigation that followed unearthed the full scope of Derek Hale's campaign. In his rural property, detectives found detailed records of every death he had orchestrated over 10 years. 23 confirmed victims, with evidence suggesting more that could never be proven. The photographs on the wall behind the workbench were identified one by one, each representing a life Hale had ended. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some called him a monster who had taken the law into his own hands. Others, in quieter voices, called him a necessary evil, a man who had done what the courts refused to do. The media debated endlessly, turning the story into a spectacle of morality and vengeance. Paul was called to testify before a grand jury, his actions during the pursuit scrutinized. He answered every question truthfully, without apology. Riley was celebrated for her work in uncovering the pattern, but she refused all interviews, retreating to her warehouse office and the cold comfort of data. In the months that followed, the case faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher outrages. Paul returned to his apartment, but the gray haze of his retirement was gone. He found himself unable to sit still, the old case files no longer a burden but a reminder of what he had failed to see for so long. He had caught the judge, but the questions the case raised about justice and vengeance remained unanswered, lingering like a stain that would not wash out. The trial of Derek Hale was brief, by legal standards. His defense did not contest the facts of the killings. Instead, they argued the circumstances, the failures of the system that had driven a man to such lengths. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Hale rose slowly, looking not at the judge but at the gallery where Paul sat in the back row. He said only that he had never enjoyed what he did, and that he hoped one day the world would not need people like him. Then he was led away in handcuffs, the doors closing behind him. Paul left the courthouse alone, the winter air sharp against his face. Riley was waiting outside, leaning against her car. She said nothing, and Paul said nothing. They stood together for a moment, two people who had been shaped by the same violence, watching the courthouse lights flicker in the fading afternoon. Riley eventually got into her car and drove away. Paul walked the city streets until night fell, past the courthouse, past the precinct, past the places where justice was supposed to be served. The case was closed. The judge was behind bars. But Paul knew that the conditions that had created Derek Hale, the failures, the inequities, the quiet injustices, had not been resolved. They remained, waiting for the next person who would decide that the system was not enough. He stopped at a bridge overlooking the river, watching the lights of the city reflect on the dark water. Then he turned and walked home, carrying the weight of what he had learned.